My name is Michael Bronski. I'm the author of Queer History of the United States and the Queer History of the United States for Young Adults. And I want to welcome our two newest authors to the book series, Queer Ideas. The Queering Carlos Ball, who we've just published, The Queering of Corporate America, How Big Business Went from an LGBTQ Adversary to Ally. And Lee Badgett, whose book, The Economic Case for LGBT Equality, Why Fair and Equal Treatment Benefits Us All, has just been published as well. So welcome both of you. I want to begin with asking each of you, callers first, to maybe describe in a few sentences or a few minutes the topic of your book and what you discuss.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Beacon Press for organizing the event. So the idea for this book came to me, I'd say around 2014, 2015, when the media was full of stories about how large corporations in the United States were becoming actively involved in political and lobbying processes in favor of LGBT equality, and in particular playing a very important role in protecting some of the advances made by the movement against conservative backlash. If you remember, in 2014, 2015, there were a lot of proposals to enact so-called religious freedom laws and so-called transgender bathroom laws. And one of the reasons that many of those laws were either not enacted to begin with, weakened after they were enacted, or in some cases actually repealed, in large part, especially in conservative states, was a result of corporate political activism on behalf of LGBT equality. And so what the book seeks to do is try to answer the question of why and how that came to be. And it's primarily a historical book. I look at essentially 50 years of LGBT activism that I argue in the book played a very important role in essentially persuading corporate America to go, as the subtitle says, from adversary to ally. I have a chapter on the 1970s activism, which targeted what I call worst offender, most discriminating corporations. I have a chapter on AIDS activism of the 1980s, on domestic partnership benefits of the 1990s. And then finally, I have a couple of chapters about what's happened in this century, where we have this sort of fascinating phenomenon where corporations have gone from being the targets of activism to the sources of activism. And we can talk during the hour about some of the reasons why that's come to be.
Thank you. Lee, do you want to give a summary of your incredibly dense and complicated book? 2 minutes?
Well, I would be happy to. And it's great to be here with you guys. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Actually, the argument's pretty straightforward. I'm asking, what happens if we look at discrimination against LGBT people in a different way? Usually we think about it as the Supreme Court did, which we'll be talking about it soon, as something that happens to individuals that violates their civil rights or violates their human rights. What I'm asking is, what if we look at it from the perspective of the economy? I argue that actually when people face discrimination in the education system, in employment, or with regard to their health, discrimination, stigma, violence, the kinds of things that happen to LGBT people, it doesn't just hurt them. It actually hurts the whole economy. So I use a lot of fair amount of data and research, but also a lot of stories about what's happened to people, which shows this kind of treatment pulls people away from getting schooling. Kids who are bullied in school are less likely to complete school. They're more likely to drop out. Their grade point averages are lower. They may not go on to college. And then it turns out actually the bullying of LGBT kids or of all kids is bad for the atmosphere for all schools. Schools don't do as well when there's bullying in the schools. So LGBT people aren't getting as much education as they want, as they're capable of. So that holds back what they have to contribute to the economy. In the workplace, discrimination, makes people more likely, makes it harder for them to find jobs. It puts them into jobs where maybe they're there because of stereotypes people have about LGBT people, or because those are places where they can get jobs. They can't get jobs that they're actually better qualified for. That's, we call that a problem of inefficiency. People aren't being used to the full extent of their skills, their knowledge, and their creativity. And discrimination in life and in the healthcare system actually is also bad for people's health. So we have lots and lots of evidence in the US and many other countries that LGBT people have health disparities. They're more likely to experience certain kinds of health conditions. And that also reduces their ability to contribute in the economy. So thinking about it from that perspective of people themselves, you start to see how that can hurt the economy. If we look at economies as a whole, several studies have found that the economies that are more accepting of LGBT people, that have better laws more inclusive laws related to LGBT people, actually perform better as overall economies. We also see when we add up the individual effects and try to put some dollar value on it, on the lost education, on the inefficiencies in the labor market, on the loss of people to health disparities. It actually adds up to, in several studies, adds up to as much as 1% of gross domestic product, of our whole output of our economies. 1% doesn't sound like a really big number, but when our GDP drops by 1%, we usually call that a recession. If we thought about that globally, 1% of the global economy is Turkey's economy. It's the Netherlands economy. It's big. So this is a meaningful number. The last thing I'll say is the businesses know this, and so it kind of has a nice tie to the work that Carlos has done. We have a lot of research that shows that businesses that are themselves more inclusive, that they do better in terms of stock prices, of productivity, of profits. So the final part, a lot of the book is about how to use this idea. We can use it alongside the arguments for human rights to strengthen them, to open doors to development agencies, to government agencies, to more businesses, and use them to start that conversation in those spaces about why it's so important that LGBT people are fully included. Businesses, unfortunately, don't always care about human rights arguments. They've gotten a little better about it, but primarily they like listening to the economic arguments. So my argument is that shifting our perspective on the experiences of LGBT people gives us a new tool, a new idea that we can work with.
Great, thank you. I should have said this earlier, but we are going to have a discussion. We have questions that we'll be discussing and talking about. But we'll be having a 10 or 15 minute question and answer period at the end. And if people who are on the call want to ask questions, you can use your Q&A function on the Zoom. So I have, as you know, since I sent them out earlier, I have a bunch of questions for us all to discuss, because I see this more as a discussion than a firing line episode where I try to trick you. But I wanted to begin way back in 1969, 1970, right? And in the early gay liberation movement, and really that's 69 to maybe beginning in 71 or so, like the first year and a half, people envisioned a sort of utopian world that by and large didn't grapple with the really hard realities of the economy or capitalism. I mean, I was part of this world, and it was clearly a wonderful utopian fantasy in which nobody considered the other part of life. Why do you think that changed pretty, as Carlos says, that actually changed pretty quickly in terms of people wanting to come to grips with both discrimination and with corporations and things? So do you see, could either of you address how that change happened?
Sure, I can give that a try first. So, it's interesting. You're absolutely right. I think, we would not characterize most we would today call queer activists back in 1969, 1970 necessarily thinking about what can be thought of as sort of harnessing the power of capitalism to kind of affect positive change. I don't think that was going through their heads at the time. But I think what ended up happening, one of the things that I argue in the book, is that the activists realized fairly early on, interestingly enough, that outside of a handful of very liberal municipalities in the US, it was easier to get large corporations to pay attention to lesbian and gay and bisexual issues than it was most elected officials in the United States. And corporations are very, very sensitive about their brands. They spend a lot of money marketing and polishing their brands. And I think activists, one of the points that I make in the book is that activists early on, very, very early on, 2 or 3 or 4 years after Stonewall, were very effective in applying pressure on corporations and really realizing that if you could get a handful of top executives and companies, and it was not easy to do in the early days by any means, but if you could get a handful of executives to start paying attention to your issues, you could advance LGBTQ equality in the private sphere in ways that you cannot in the public sphere. So one of the things that I make in the one of the points that I make in the argument is this was a very highly pragmatic sort of how do we affect change? Where can we apply pressure that will lead to change? And so you have companies like the 3 major television networks as early as 1975 adopting anti-discrimination policies on the basis of sexual orientation. You have big companies like IBM and AT&T doing the same at around the same time. And again, outside of Berkeley, California and Cambridge, Massachusetts, you don't have that kind of legislative response to LGBTQ activism that early on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it's a great question. I mean, I'm kind of tempted to say that those folks were young, and once they got jobs, they kind of realized they had something else at stake. But I think that there's probably a lot of reasons behind that. I mean, of course, in the 1960s, we also saw the civil rights movement make wins that actually, I think, were models for some of the work that the LGBT movement did later. And at least some of that was about figuring out how to get wedges in to big corporations and to other employers to make available jobs for women and people of color. So I think it's, that was a big issue. And so I think it's not surprising. I think it's hard to say too. I mean, the other parts of the zeitgeist, I think, have to do with, as we learn more about capitalism, even the new left in the 1960s, we learned there were lots of different kinds of capitalism. There were kinds that could be regulated in ways that would be good for us as employees. And I think that's, both that and the civil rights movement, I think may have contributed to thinking about that as a useful tool, as a useful site of protest and of change.
Right. I mean, I just know that being involved with publishing early in a vague way back in those years, right? That in fact, the New York publishing world almost immediately understood the power of the gay image and began to sign up people for gay books and gay editors to actually promote gay series of books, right? Which very much goes to what Carlos was actually saying, right? Was that it actually, when people see that it's, and you too, Lee, that if it's in their benefit to make money, they'll be much more happy to do it. At that point, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of larger movement, right? And obviously, when we say the LGBTQ movement, it's composed of many, many different people over long periods of time, and they all have very different opinions, right? I mean, there's an old saying, right? That if you put five Jews in a room, you'll have 7 opinions, and if you put 5 LGBT people in a room, you'll have 20 opinions, all of which will be conflicting within the very people talking. So, but there have been aspects of the movement that focus on personal liberation of coming out, that have focused on combating legal and judicial discrimination. Others have focused on changing the public image of LGBTQ people and presenting it in a different way, not as a danger to society, but as a boon. And I think each of your books really sort of grapples. I mean, those are three vague or loose trends within the movements. And each of your books sort of looks at these in different ways. I think each of the books actually deals with them, but in very different ways. You want to address that in some way?
Yeah, I think.
And that capitalism and all addresses all of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a movement here, especially kind of relatively well-developed LGBT movements, where there are many options for people. I think you can have groups that disagree with each other or sort of have very different perspectives. You can have queers for economic justice, and you can have lesbians who tech, and there's plenty of room for both of them to exist and to pursue things that they're interested in. I think it's a very interesting question about how movements that are so entrepreneurial in many ways, can kind of stay attuned to the people who, in some ways, they are accountable to. I think we've seen an expansion of the types of people getting involved in LGBT rights, just an expansion of types of LGBT people. And I think that's what happened with the marriage equality movement. There were many people who thought this shouldn't be our priority. When Evan Wolfson started trying to get something going in Hawaii in the mid-1990s, he was told, don't do it. It's not going to be an official thing for our organization. He did it anyway. And I think, the marriage equality movement was an example of LGBT people voting with their feet, saying we do care about these things very much. So I think that the same kinds of things are happening in terms of non-discrimination laws. People spend a lot of time in the workplace. They want to be in a workplace that's respectful to them, where they have opportunities. And I think the kind of movement we have now is just trying to marshal all these different arguments to push employers to do the right thing, because after all, that's who pays for our health insurance, for most people who have health insurance. That's who might be contributing to your pension plan. It's their success determines whether or not you have a paycheck every week. So it's it's not surprising that that particular site has become so important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to think historically in terms of the advances of the LGBT movement, the way in which the workplace became a political site, a site for activism. And, one benefit that at least some LGBT people had, maybe the ones who it was easier for them to quote unquote pass than others, was that, when you had very explicit policies of no African Americans can work here, or no Jews can work here, it was easier to exclude than it was to exclude closeted LGBT people. So there were already LGBT people in these workplaces. And so when that process of activism and of educating employers began, there was an advantage, a kind of built-in advantage, because it wasn't talking about abstractions of fairness and equality and justice as it applied to other people. It was the people that kind of were already there, but who were so afraid that the discrimination in those workplaces was so intense, nonetheless, about their being open, that it allows sort of employers, those who allowed themselves to say, well, wait a minute, this is employee X, they've been working for me for a long time, they're good workers. I don't, it's not, to go back to Lee's point, it may not be consistent with my economic bottom line to let them go. Let me learn a little bit more about sexual orientation and eventually about gender identity. Now, did this happen in most work sites in the 1970s and 80s? No, right? I mean, it's important in the story that I tell. The story that I tell in the book is generally a positive one, and I focus on those large corporations that kind of did the right thing sort of early on. But I make it very clear that they were the exception to the rule, right? That it took a long time for corporations to, writ large, start to adopt and embrace these policies. But you needed these pioneer corporations. And more importantly, you needed the pioneer activists. And, you know, most people like myself who spend our academic careers writing about the movement, we've focused for understandable reasons primarily on the relationship between the movement and the state, between the movement and the government, trying to get the government to do X or Y. And I don't think we have, and it's one of the things that I love about Lee's book, is I don't think we have paid enough attention to the relationship between the movement and the private sector. And that's something, that's one of the common themes, I guess, between Lee's book and myself. We want to bring attention to what happens in the private sector, as Lee says, as a supplement to the broader struggle for human rights.
Right. No, that's great, because it made, both of your answers made me think about the sort of larger question of whether it be the private sector, whether it be the government, whether it be actually judicial reform, or whether it be legislative reform, right? But they all deal with, and people have spoken about this from the beginning, notions of equality. And both of the books made me think about that. I mean, we're all happy to say, oh, that we want LGBT equality, but that happens in different ways for different people and different groups, right? So I wonder if each of you could actually discuss a little bit about how you see notions of equality, because I think there's more than one playing out in each of your stories.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I think in the historical trajectory that I tell, I think there was I think an enrichment of the equality claim, right? The equality claim in the early days in the 70s was relatively straightforward. It was, you know, I am gay, or I'm lesbian, or I'm bisexual, and, you know, don't fire me as a result of that, okay? Let me basically, you know, leave me alone, right? Just let me do my job. I have my private life separate from my workplace life, and, you know, if you can provide me with that, you know, I am content. I think, you know, the demands on the part of the movement understandably sort of moved beyond that basic minimal equality. You know, you start to see it in the 1980s, you know, with the rampant and toxic discrimination that resulted from the AIDS epidemic. And that really exposed the way in which sexual minorities were completely unprotected by the law in terms of rights and benefits. And as we see, I think as the decades progress, a greater, more expansive understanding of the demands of LGBT people, where, you know, being left alone, quote unquote, is not enough, all the way to, you know, real equality is not possible, the argument became, until you recognize fully our relationships as marital for those of us who choose to marry, and it's an arch. It's an expansion of the understanding of justice and of equality. And the way that I think of it, it becomes richer as time goes on. Now, it doesn't mean that we're there yet. There's a lot of work to do, and we can talk about that when we shift the conversation to the future, but I think generally speaking, the conception of equality has changed in the sense that it has become appropriately so more richer and more demanding of society, of government, and of the private sector.
Yeah, I think that more complicated, richer kind of understanding is something that seems very familiar to me as well. Thinking about it as an economist, less as a lawyer. Policy is a tool to try to reduce inequality. So studying the kind of inequality that I primarily study would be in people's lived experience. So not so much, you know, kind of what the law tells us about what their position is. And I think that's that's a very different and important kind of role to think about. It's a sobering one because you realize how hard it is that inequality in the United States, at any rate, for LGBT people is still there in terms of wage gaps for gay and bisexual men, poverty gaps, which are enormous for transgender people, lesbians sort of facing the double pressure of being women in an economy that doesn't treat women very well. So there are many different kinds of ways, and we haven't even gotten into, kind of finer grained details around intersectionality for people of different racial and ethnic groups. But anyway, so there's inequality in terms of people's actual access to jobs and to a livelihood that's adequate. And I think that's, to me, kind of where we have to go. I think, I know, like in the affirmative action debates, there's a big question about, are you going to just be process oriented and make sure a process is fair, or are you going to make sure the results are fair? And I argue that, the law is a little better on the process side. I think we have to figure out how we're going to do well on the results side. The EEO, well, we'll talk about the Supreme Court case in a few minutes. I won't jump into that. Right. But anyway, so the lived experience as a different kind of measure of equality, I think, is important to keep in mind.
Right. I mean, I think since our event is called The Future of the Gay Movement, we'll go to the future soon at some point. But I actually want to talk a little bit about the present, right? And this week has seen, I think, two extraordinary moments, right? The first was, it's seen actually about 20 extraordinary moments. But the first big one for me was the Supreme Court ruling earlier this week, essentially granting some degree of protection for LGBT people in employment. And I'm sure I have reduced that to its minimal essence. But the other one, right, was the enormous outpouring to Black Lives Matter from corporations. And it was in the news the last 2 days, right? Quaker Oats saying that they're getting rid of the Antrum Ima brand. This morning, Uncle Ben's converted rice was going to be changed, and then cream of wheat. And in the times before, they mentioned the land of lakes butter and Eskimo pies, all of which are incredibly offensive. My phone. So what is it about? So I want to talk about two things. What is it about this moment in which this is all happening? And what does that bode for the future, do each of you think?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I don't know that the Supreme Court was responding to what's going on in the streets, but we, right. They certainly seem to be responding to over the decades-long change on LGBT rights issues. I mean, even Alito and Kavanaugh, tried to make it clear that they think discrimination against LGBT people is wrong. They just think Congress should take care of it, not the Supreme Court, right? So there's definitely something there. But the fact is, huge majorities of people in the United States have favored equal employment opportunities for LGBT people for decades. I mean, this is not new. It's just finally they're kind of catching up with it. And I think my colleague, Don Tomaskovic-Deevy, who's a sociologist at UMass, who's studied kind of the impact of civil rights laws in the labor market, argues that really they work best when there is a social movement behind them to push employers, to push the government to take action. And so that makes me much more optimistic to hear that corporations are making these kinds of changes that you just talked about, Michael. And I hope that that's also going to push our enforcement agencies and result in some serious change for all the groups that face tremendous disadvantage in the labor markets.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to talk about the two separately because I think they're worth separate sort of analyses. But I was also struck by the dissenting opinions in the Supreme Court decision this week, as much as by the majority. The extent in which Justice Alito, in particular, goes page after page after page, essentially summarizing the long and ugly history against LGBT people. Mm-hmm. in the United States. Of course, the reason he's doing that is because he says this is a separate form of discrimination. This is not sex discrimination. This is discrimination against transgender and lesbians and gay men, and we need a separate statute. But nonetheless, you know, for the very most conservative justices to be recognizing that long and ugly history of discrimination says a lot about the way in which the movement with a capital M, Michael, has succeeded in persuading the vast majority of Americans about the rightness of the demands for equality. You know, my response to my initial reaction to what the corporations have been doing on issues related to race over the last few weeks is actually kind of an amazement and an embarrassment and anger, quite frankly, that it has taken this long, for example, to get the Antrum Ima marketing albatross off of that particular product, for example. I think it says so much about us as a country that we have tolerated that kind of blatant racism for so long. And so the Supreme Court opinion is a wonderful step forward. The fact that the corporations are doing this now, yes, thank you. But where have you been? Where have you been for decades now on these issues? It's something that I find very troubling.
Right, and I would say that the Antrum Ima brand has been there for 138 years. So it's not new. And right, and when they did, because there had actually been protests against the Antrum Ima image since around the time of Gone with the Wind in 1939. And, you know, by the early 80s, they changed Antrum Ima from the mammy figure to a more middle-class housewife with a bandana rather than a headscarf. So they've had plenty of opportunity to change things for decades.
No, that's right. And I think if, you know, I think one of the things that the LGBTQ movement has done fairly well over the last 20 to 30 years is not accepting from corporations simple and easy kind of marketing stuff, right? That yeah, the marketing is important, and how you present yourself to the outside world and selling your widgets or whatever it is important. But we also care about what's happening inside your corporation. How are you treating minority employees? What is the representation on your board? What are you saying the right things, but then not following up in terms of pushing for policy, right? Because corporations push for policy all the time on taxation, on regulation. And it's a matter of pushing them to add civil rights to that political agenda. Because the question is not whether corporations are political actors in our society. They clearly are. The question is on what issues are they going to fight on. And it's up to us, both as consumers and as activists, to push them in the right direction.
So do each of you see this moment, and Lee is of course correct that in fact the Supreme Court didn't react for the last week and a half. They've been discussing this actively for this case for over a year and for over many years before that. And clearly both of these things are positive in many ways. Do you see them as really illuminating the way to the future in progressive, active ways, or are they just going to be sort of like, we've done this and now we'll see what happens with it?
Well, I hope
change, or is it just a flash?
I hope not. I mean, I think Carlos's argument that, you know, we have and need to continue to kind of hold them to those agreements is an important one, and I think that's really the key to it all. And you know, now we know we've developed lots of tools to be able to do that. You know, with investor pressure and boycotts and other kinds of kind of more direct actions. I mean, there are many kinds of opportunities. And what's fascinating to me is that people are reaching into, you know, the worlds that are around them. So I'm on Econ Twitter, of course, and we have, a very lively conversation anytime any issue comes up. But right now we're seeing on Econ Twitter and lots of other kinds of academic Twitter, sort of the, hearing about the experiences. I forget the hashtag, Black in the Ivory, where people are, talking about their day-to-day experiences. And I think that's been very powerful. It's an opportunity for us all to hear things that we normally would not hear from our Black colleagues about what their experiences have been. So I think, we've got these pieces, and the question is, can we kind of knit together these movements to make them all stronger when it comes to things like pushing corporations or pushing the policymakers to back up these lofty ideals of equality with some actual action.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of sort of going forward, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the way in which the transgender rights movement is kind of exploding and questioning in very effective ways the whole idea of binary gender, and it'll be very, I think, going forward, both in terms of the movement and in terms of the private sector and the government, sort of, what happens with that, because, the LGBT movement in particular has been, especially when working through the courts, has been very sort of identity-based. And so it is because of my identity X, the argument usually goes, that I deserve protection Y, right? But I think one of the things, and it is striking, right? I mean, it's striking, the decision the Supreme Court made on Monday, released on Monday, is the first transgender case that had ever reached the Supreme Court. I mean, so in some ways, transgender rights sort of fast forwarded, at least when it comes to legal issues before the Supreme Court. What took decades for the gay and lesbian and bisexual movement, transgender rights in terms of litigation in front of the Supreme Court happened very quickly. But sort of how do we harness that going forward, I think, is a very important question. And I think ultimately, as a normative matter, I think we have to start thinking about de-emphasizing particular identities and emphasizing the fluidity of sexuality, of gender, which is, easy to do or easier to do, let's say, in an academic context, or maybe even in an educational context. But there are challenges when you try to translate that into political activism, into changes in the law. And that's something to sort of, that we need to be as a movement and as academics behind the movement and studying the movement, thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Right. I was struck earlier, I guess it was this past weekend, when George Floyd's brother said, I believe he's done it, actually wanted to, the case of the question of racism within the United States to the United Nations and make it a global issue, which was interesting because actually the Black Panthers had a similar argument back in 1973, I believe, where they wanted to go to the UN and put the US on trial for racism, because both of your books deal with corporations, with economics, with capitalism, and we live in a global society. How do you see each of your projects as playing out globally? Since obviously everything is now connected much more than it was 50 years ago or 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wrote this book because of the activists I was meeting in different parts of the world who wanted something to work with in addition to the human rights argument. The spaces they wanted to get into were close to them, from businesses and development banks, and they saw the need to reach into those kinds of institutions as well. So I think we're seeing a global movement being born. I mean, people are connected across different movements. There are several types of organizations that convene activists from all over the world. They learn from each other. We've worked together on different kinds of things. For example, I worked with the UN Development Program and a bunch of activists around the world and the World Bank on an LGBTI inclusion index. So at the global level, we're actually even expanding the LGBT acronym to include people who identifies intersex. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of an innovation that's coming really from the rest of the world that's just now really starting to play out in the US. So we're talking across borders, we're learning from each other. It's a very exciting time in that way. I mean, I think, as I say in the book, I feel like we're all developing countries when it comes to LGBT issues. So it's really important that we are thinking about how what we do here matters elsewhere and vice versa.
Right. I mean, it's been a commonplace, right, that the gay movement started in America and we exported it and other countries followed us in certain ways, right? Back in the 70s.
Is that how it really started?
Well, no, of course not. It started, go back to
Yeah.
Germany in 1860,
Yeah, right.
1868, right? But people want to locate Stonewall as the origin story. Mm. Do you, at this moment, do you see the US being a leader of this globally, or other countries taking the lead? Or is it collaborative?
Yeah, I think it's more collaborative. I mean, I think this probably happens in a lot of countries around the world. I think we're particularly guilty of this in the United States. That we tend to think that it all begins and ends here, or that we go first and everybody follows us, and that's just not true. I think it is much more collaborative. I think if you when 100 years from now, when people are writing about the marriage equality movement, they're going to be writing about what was happening in a lot of different countries in several different continents, and the way in which what happened in Holland and what was happening in Argentina, actually had an effect in the United States and vice versa. And so, I suppose, one of the benefits of a more global world, a more interconnected world, economically, technologically, is that you can have that kind of interaction and collaboration that Lee was talking about, and it's exciting. It's also, bringing it back to issues related to capitalism, and I mean, obviously, a lot of this is also, it comes down to sort of what, do we want a capitalist system? What kind of capitalist system do we want? What kind of values do we want a capitalist economy to have? For me, it's really exciting to be talking about that big question and bringing into it the issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity, which then becomes part of an even bigger conversation. So I agree with Lee. This is an exciting time. Whether the U.S. is leading or not, I'd say, I don't know. The last 3.5 years have been so bizarre. I can't really say that we're leading on much these days. But
right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at a basic level of equality or freedom, which would be to decriminalize same-sex activity, the US was pathetically, woefully, horribly centuries behind France, decades and decades behind England.
Yeah, 2003. I mean, it shocks people when I tell them that
right.
That's when, our sodomy laws are finally struck down.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I claim 1958, even though France did it in 1784.
Oh yeah! Wow!
With the revolution.
Yeah. Well, I think the one way that I do see the U.S. exerting leadership is through corporations. A lot of U.S. corporations have kind of, taken their knowledge of what to do here and taken it to other places. Not to every place necessarily that they operate, but there's some pressure on them to do that. I mean, I think otherwise, though, funders in the U.S., we mostly fund U.S. related movements. I was on a webinar with some activists in Eastern Europe the other day, and I was saying how bad the COVID crisis was. Like, all these LGBT organizations have laid people off, and I just forgot completely as I was saying this. And then one of them said, "Well, that's very nice. We're all volunteers here anyway." Mm-hmm. I mean, so So if you look at where money goes to the LGBT movement, it's mostly to the U.S. The rest of the world has very little to work with. So I think that's another important thing that that I hope that this kind of economic case and working with corporations might be helpful for creating more sources of funding for LGBT groups in other places too.
Right. We have about 8 minutes left, and or even fewer than that actually. Are there any questions people want to put in the Q&A? We can answer them quickly. And the big question is, do I know how to work the Q&A? There are no open questions. Right. I mean, I think if there are no questions, we can begin to wrap up as well. Would each of you like to give a very, very short summary of where you think things may be? I want to say that the sea change will happen in November when Trump is out and what that might mean. Or just to sort of wrap up our discussion of what you see for the immediate future, meaning the next 2 years.
Yeah, go ahead.
Specifically in terms of corporations, one of the points that I make in my book, and there are different ways of coming at this, and a lot of it has to do with what the objective is. But one of the very interesting things that I think has happened in the last 6-7 years related to LGBT issues is the way in which large corporations and social conservatives, which used to be, which are still in some ways, but the relationship is becoming a more difficult one, used to be such an important part of the Reagan coalition, right? You have your libertarian conservatives, you had your social conservatives generally supporting the Republican Party. And I think it's really interesting the way in which LGBT issues have created a wedge between large corporations and social traditional conservatives, to the point where if you read some of the criticism of political activism in Arizona, in Arkansas, and Indiana a few years ago involving some of these anti-gay laws, you would think they were written by hardcore leftists, right? I mean, corporations are taking over our country, they have so much political power. This was a criticism that was coming from social conservatives. And I think that opens up some opportunities for progressives in terms of coalition work, but we have to be very careful. Because one of the points that I make in the book is that we can't think of corporations as being the salvation of progressive politics in the United States. This would be a terrible mistake. I think the way to look at it is to be, in my opinion, to be pragmatic about it. I think there are on some issues, corporations are moving in the right direction, and that opens up opportunities for change. But on many other issues, including environmental regulation, including taxation, including union rights, large corporations in this country continue to hold very, very problematic positions. And I think it's very important for progressives to keep pushing corporations to do the right thing.
Right. We actually had a question come in that Carlos had just sort of answered, which was about feelings about, do corporations use sponsorship at Pride as a promotional stunt, essentially, and not followed up with any activity? It was clearly yes for some and not for others. Do either of you have a quick take on that?
Yeah, there's lots of examples of activists following very closely to make sure that the companies that they're walking their talk. And you've got some great examples in your book, Carlos, I think, about that.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think the problem is that it can only be marketing sometimes. It can only be like a very superficial thing. And that's why there has to be, I mean, it's nice that they're helping to sponsor Pride events. I think it's a valid criticism at the same time when people in the community say, but wait a minute, right? I mean, there's too much Bank of America here. There's too much IBM. And so I think we have to be careful about that because they do have money and they can be sometimes generous with the money, but they're using the money for a particular purpose, and I think the movement also has to be smart in terms of when it's going to accept money and under what conditions. So it's a sign of progress, but it's only but at the end of the day, it's symbolism, and you need more than that. You need more than that for real change.
Yeah.
Right. We're just about ending. Lee, would you like to make a final statement?
Yeah, I would just say I think Carlos has made a really important point about corporations and having having a subtle strategy to think about how we work with them. I think the same way about the idea that LGBT equality is good for the economy in the same way, is that we wouldn't make this argument if we didn't have a human rights argument behind it to make sure that we're not doing something bad, right? So I think that is a useful link to make. I actually think, both our books were written before the COVID crisis. I think we're going to see a new emphasis, especially in other countries, in low-income countries in particular, for LGBT people, a new emphasis on thinking about that lived experience. And, we're just starting to hear about the devastation of economies and loss of community spaces and places for people to be safe in their community. So I think that the COVID crisis isn't necessarily going to change the things that we're doing, but I think it's going to intensify it quite a bit and make it much more urgent.
Great. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on the first Beacon virtual author event for Pride Month, and remind everybody that next Thursday at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, we'll have Dr. Mary Frances Berry and Dr. Jean Theo Harris speaking about the history of civil rights and protest movements in America, and that'll be moderated by Keisha Blaine. So thank you very much for coming.
Right.
Thank you everybody for helping set this up. Thank you for Beacon Press for publishing all of our books. And we hope to see you next week.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.